Hello, Jeff. It's great to be talking to you again. We did an interview for Vanity Fair that we published after the first tranche of new JFK files came out in the beginning of 2025. And now we've had another group of documents that 62 pages to be exact that came out from the CIA that most people, I think, will not understand how significant this recent revelation is.
Yeah, yes. This is a complicated story, and while the Joannides file that was released is important, it has to be seen in context with a whole lot of stuff that has been released about Joannides in recent years, and also about CIA operations involving Oswald. So there's this revelation which kind of pokes a hole in the official story, punctures the official story. And there are these other documents that widen that hole and let us see what was going on, what was really going on in 1963 that the CIA hasn't wanted to talk about.
Right. So I want to go back and do the building blocks to give
Okay.
everybody that context. And
Yeah.
you're in fact the best person to be doing it since you've been following this story since 1998. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. But I wanted to start with the concept of everybody saying nothing's coming out in the new JFK files. They're yawning, they're saying nothing new. And what troubles me is that the people that say that do not have any sort of history of really researching deeply this stuff to understand what is new and what is important. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you agree that
Yeah,
people?
I mean, the response is this isn't important and we're not going to talk about it because it isn't important. But in fact, what one thing that the Joannides file shows is that the CIA has been deliberately covering up these actions in 1963, and that cover story was repeated to all investigations. It was repeated as recently as 1998. And so now that that cover story has been removed, the critics who say, well, you haven't proven that there's a conspiracy to kill the president. No, we've exposed a CIA operation involving the man who supposedly killed the president, for which there is no explanation.
Yeah,
And so the Joannides file really changes the burden of proof. It's not up to us who've discovered the story and discovered the CIA's falsehood to come up with a theory about what was going on. We're not conspiracy theorists. We're trying to figure out what happened and why the CIA, made these deceptive statements. And so the Joannides file helps us understand that the CIA's story is false. What was
yeah,
really happening, that's what needs to be explained.
yeah. So let's go back and let's build
Yeah,
this piece by piece.
sure.
Start with your history in this, your deep history in following up on this topic of George Joannides.
Yeah.
Starting in 1998, you were working for the Washington Post and you started working on this and you thought this was important. You would eventually bring a lawsuit, but why don't you go back and just describe who Joannides is,
Yeah. So,
what you
so,
knew about him, and why you
so
became so interested?
when I had never wanted to write about the JFK story because I felt there was nothing new to say until new JFK records began to be put into the National Archives in the mid 1990s, 1994, 1995. And so I thought there would be interesting stories in those files, not trying to solve the assassination, but trying to come up with interesting stories about what was going on back then, because people were always interested in that, especially as it related to the assassination. And sure enough, there were lots of those stories in there, and one of them concerned the CIA support for a group called the Cuban Student Directorate, which was interesting because that was the group that had publicized Lee Harvey Oswald's activities before the assassination. And the fact that they were CIA funded it was sort of known to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, but it wasn't really like explored or explained. So I wanted to try and understand that better. And in those documents, I found several memoranda addressed to somebody in the CIA named Howard. So I took this to the Washington Post investigative unit. Rick Atkinson was the editor. And I said, look, here's all these JFK files. And there's a bunch of guys named in here who I checked. They're still alive. They're in Miami and they could talk about this and what was going on with these Cubans in Miami who knew something about Oswald before the assassination. Rick said, "That's interesting. Go down there, interview. Let's see what they say. What's the explanation?" So I went there. I spent maybe a week, interviewed 3 or 4 people, and they told me about this guy Howard, who they knew, who they described as a lawyer, probably from New York, had a New York accent, always very well dressed. They stressed that. Described him as Mediterranean, maybe Jewish, with the distinctive features of, of people from that region. So, they described him in pretty good detail. Then, a couple of years later, so I was curious about who this guy was. Howard, was that Howard Hunt? I called up Howard Hunt because Howard Hunt actually knew the Cuban students. He had worked in Miami. So he was very gruff, but no, he wasn't it. That was clear. So who was Howard? I didn't know it. And then the JFK Review Board published a memo in 1998 from the CIA. They had asked, who was this guy Howard in Miami? And the memo said Howard didn't exist. Said, we don't know anything about this guy, and we don't think he existed. We don't know anything about him. So
Yeah.
in
And just
the,
for our readers' purposes,
yeah,
the disclosures that we can look at from the JFK assassination are the Warren Commission.
yeah,
Then you have the 1978 House Committee that
right.
is the second investigation, really comes out of the Zapruder film being publicized by Geraldo Rivera on late night
Yes.
TV. And then we have JFK, the movie, which provokes what's the AARB
Yeah, the
board.
JFK Records Act
Yeah.
says the government has to release all its JFK records and creates this board.
Yeah. So you get to 1998 when the CIA is being asked, who's Howard?
Right.
Because all the people, and let's talk about the directorate before we get a little bit further in this story. The Cuban directorate, describe who they are, where they were located, what they did, and now
So,
what we're finding out.
so the Cuban Student Directorate was, politically active college students at the leading universities in Cuba, primarily University of Havana, but others, LaSalle, um, that were involved in politics. And uh, when the Cuban government under Castro begins to take a hard left turn early in the revolution, Castro has widespread public support when he comes to power and overthrows the pro-American dictatorship, but it becomes clear that he's moving in a sort of communist direction, a one-party state. It's not going to be followed up by elections. And so students are opposing communism and they fight, and this is they get expelled from school. They get attacked on the street. They get arrested. So those students retreat to Miami where they get funding from the CIA. And this is a big movement. I mean, this is the middle class of Cuba, which is threatened by dispossession by this communist revolution. And so these are active students fighting for the future of their country. There's lots of them, men and women, who are organizing to denounce Castro's takeover of the schools, the universities, everything, human rights abuses. And they grow because there's lots of opposition, people leaving Cuba to escape the repression. And the CIA picks up these kids and funds them because the CIA is trying to overthrow Castro and they want to rally public support. They want to rally these committed young people. So the CIA takes over, and the way it works is they assign a case officer to the group. And the case officer supplies the money, typically in cash, and then, follows what the group is doing, doesn't tell the group what to do. I mean, they don't need any telling that Castro's a bad guy and they want to stop him. They're passionately committed to saving their country from communism. So, but the CIA wants to guide them in certain directions. They want to know what they're doing. They want to get intelligence from them. And so this becomes a very, good relationship for both. And the Cuban Student Directorate was one of the best, most effective, largest organizations in Miami opposing the Castro government. And they also had the additional feature of they weren't compromised by connections to the old regime of Batista and corruption. These were idealistic young people who truly were fighting against the communist takeover of their country. So the CIA picks them up and starts funding them. And after a couple of years in 1962, that's when this man, Joannides is called in to handle them. So he's
Yeah,
going
so
to,
let's talk about that
yeah,
turn because that's an important turn in this story. They go by the acronym DRE, which is Directorate, whatever. Uh,
Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil. It's
yeah,
Revolutionary Student Directorate in Spanish.
yeah, and they truly are like, budding professionals. They become doctors and lawyers and things like
Yeah.
that. But they really center around um, the University of Miami in Florida, where the CIA had its station. It
Yes.
was codenamed,
JM Wave
yeah.
was that.
So,
Yeah.
and by the way, I found it fascinating that you've written about that station was one of the largest CIA stations in the world at
I
the
think it
time.
was the largest.
Yeah.
And it was one of the largest employers in the state of Florida. I mean, it's really an extraordinary phenomenon of a foreign intelligence service based in a domestically.
Yeah. So JFK has this great triumph by solving the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962.
Right.
And the problem, he has a problem that we have currently with the bombing of Iran, where some of the students from the directorate came out and said, "Oh, there's missiles that are hidden, actually,
Yeah.
that they're not really removing." And they go on the Today Show and say this is bad news for us because they were unhappy that JFK didn't use the opportunity to get rid of Castro in the
Yeah.
Cuban.
So, Americans celebrated the Cuban end of the Cuban Missile Crisis with tremendous relief. War was avoided, nuclear war. And so Kennedy shoots up in the poll. He's very popular, but in Miami, the result of the res of the missile crisis was Castro was still sitting right there.
Yeah,
And
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 we
and
and we had
so
agreed not to attack him too,
yeah,
as part of the
yeah, and
settlement.
we had so the feeling was Kennedy had given Castro sanctuary. Kennedy had actually protected Castro. That's the way it was perceived in Miami. And so a lot of bitterness against JFK is immediately evident. And the Cuban Student Directorate, because they are active and high profile, when they make this charge, missiles in caves, it's on the front page of the Washington Star, which was the biggest newspaper in the capital at that time. So
Yeah,
they
and so
had the ability to impact public opinion.
yeah, and JFK sees this and he's not happy about it, and he calls in Richard Helms from the
Right.
CIA and says, get these people under control. This doesn't help me at all to control this situation, to have these students saying rogue things like missiles are still out there. And so Helms goes back and rubs his hands together and says, okay, I'll tell them to knock it off, but I'll also encourage them in what they're doing because we're actually kind of happy with what they're doing. So he goes back and says, I'm going to give you to one of their leaders who he brings to Washington, one of the DRE leaders. He said, I'm going to give you a case officer who will be involved in this and help you out. And this, so we're talking October, November, December of 1962.
December, Joannides meets the Cuban student leaders in December 1962 for the first
Okay.
time.
All right. So he's brought in, and let's describe who he is at that point, where he came from, and
Yeah.
how he fits in then here.
Um, George Joannides was the son of Greek immigrants who worked at a Greek language newspaper in New York. He grew up in New York. He was 4F in World War II, so he didn't fight in World War II, but he became a journalist and a lawyer in New York, and in after the war went to work for the Greek embassy in Washington as a public relations man because of his journalism background, and it was there that he became a contract employee for the CIA. He was, I guess, spying on the Greek embassy. After 6 years, he was sent to Athens as an operations officer. And so he becomes a full-fledged, covert operator in Athens. Speaks fluent Greek, fluent French, so was very well, equipped for that assignment. And gets high marks for his work. And so he's 40 years old in 1962, and Helms send takes him out of the Athens station. They're cleaning house in Miami because they've had this disastrous defeat at the Bay of Pigs. and they want all new people. And Helms brings in Joannides, and he has a few assignments, but then he's given this assignment, get these Cuban students under control in late 1962. So
Okay,
that's
so
the mission.
and this is the really important part of the story right now,
Yeah.
where the revelation that we just got on July 3rd, and by the way, why do they always release stuff right before a holiday or on a weekend?
And Biden did the exact same thing. Yes, it's not an accident that they released this on the right before the holiday
Yeah.
weekends.
Yeah. So July 3rd, 2025 is when we first get this information. And that's why this is so important. And this is its context right now. It's one document, but it's hugely important.
Yeah.
And
And
so what happens is you find a document in this release that shows that the CIA issued a fake driver's license to Joannides under the name Howard
right.
Gerber or something like that.
Howard Gebler, yeah.
Gebler, yeah.
So that memo that the review board was given in 1998, they didn't look into it anymore. The CIA said this guy doesn't exist. We don't have his records. We don't know anything about him. So the review board said, okay, like they went on to the next record. They didn't know that, in fact, what we now know, which is that story just wasn't true.
Yeah, and what's important about this is that the reason the question about Howard had been asked is there were a ton of memos in 1963 and before into the late 1962 from the student directorate group of people to a guy named Howard. And just
Yeah, no, and so, those were the guys I had talked to originally, and they showed me their papers, and that their relationship with this guy. They talked very openly about it, and the CIA was saying it never happened. So when we get this file, that fake driver's license proved that they did know who Howard was. They had given him that alias. They
right.
had given him that ability to that false identity. He presented himself as a lawyer from the Department of Army.
Yeah,
But
and
until
so
we,
just so everybody knows that how important this context is. The Warren Commission knew nothing about this.
right,
The House committee knew nothing about it. We'll talk about why they didn't.
right,
And even the AARB were, in 98, they were being told the guy didn't exist. We don't know the guy who investigated it and sent the memo you've talked to. And he said he didn't even know about this driver's license himself.
right. No, and so the guy who wrote the bad memo in 1998 saying we didn't know anything about this, when this file came out, I called him and I said, "Look at this driver's license. You did know, or somebody knew because you had done that." And his explanation was very interesting, and it supports what I'm talking about here, which was he said, I went and checked the CIA's, they have a database for aliases. Everybody in the agency who takes an alias, that's registered somewhere so that you can figure out, they know what their people were doing when they were working undercover. Well, they had given him the fake driver's license, and there's some paperwork from what's called the Technical Services Division, which does the forged documents and that sort of thing. But they didn't, whoever created that driver's license on Joannides' behalf, didn't put that alias into the database. Well, the effect of that would be that nobody within the CIA would have known that who Howard was, or that Joannides was acting at Howard. And so it was like it was taken out of the system so that it would be invisible. And
Yeah.
that you have this quality throughout this file where things are taken out of the record. Like this is an operation that is designed to be invisible to the CIA. That's why it has escaped public notice for so long, because even within the CIA, when this guy, Barry Harrelson, is asked about it, he didn't know. He was answering honestly, but he had been fed bad information.
Yeah.
So,
And the importance then about all this is we're finding out for the first time in 62 years, something that's been vehemently denied, including in a 15-year lawsuit that you brought, that Howard was a real person within the CIA. They couldn't tell you who these student directorate people were dealing with. And as it turns out, here's his fake driver's license that identifies him. But then secondarily, you find out that he was made invisible in the CIA itself because his alias wasn't registered
yeah.
with the CIA. So Plausible deniability on top of plausible deniability means that Jefferson Morley spends 15 years in a lawsuit where they're telling the government's telling the judge there is no such guy. In
Yeah.
all these investigative groups, the Warren Commission never knew about any of this. House Committee didn't know about it. In um,
The
AARP
review.
didn't know about it. Okay, so now we're finding out. So that's why this is so big, because this confirms what you suspected and why you pushed so hard for these Joannides files. And everybody says, well, nobody's telling you who shot the president, but the answer is no, but somebody's telling us who Howard is. And that's important for the reasons we'll talk about right now, what exactly the student directorate group did under his leadership. We
Yeah.
now know it was his leadership. And this is why they were hiding his identity all these years, because it looks pretty bad for the CIA and its involvement with Oswald in particular, which we'll
Yeah.
get
So
into.
no, it's not smoking gun proof of a conspiracy. It's smoking gun proof of a CIA operation involving Oswald that was never disclosed.
Right,
You
right,
know, and so that raised the question: was that an operation to kill the president? Well, I mean, when something's hidden for this long, your tendency would be to think the explanation is more nefarious than innocent. But you know, let's see.
yeah,
I mean, uh, uh, that's why these types of disclosures matter because we can figure it out.
yeah. And one point that I want to get in here before we get to what the DRE group did under his leadership is in 1978, when the House was looking at the JFK assassination officially for a second time after the Warren Commission, um, again, because of the Zapruder film being released, in that particular investigation, the CIA sends none other than Joannides himself to control what that group is going to find out.
Right. He's brought in as the senior uh, advisor to the coordinator. There was a guy in the CIA Inspector General's office who was coordinating all the response. And Joannides is brought in as his right-hand man to handle questions directed at the operations directorate.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So he's the guy controlling what the CIA information will be given to the House, and he discloses to nobody. By the way, I was running this group. So that's a really bad look. And I think I
yeah, no,
see.
I mean, what it is the fox is in charge of the hen house.
Right, right. In
No, I
terms of
mean,
disclosure.
I
Yeah,
mean, I mean, uh, so yeah, the fact that he's brought in 15 years later, in this position where, you know, w without him, they see nothing. So he
right.
he becomes the eyes and ears of the congressional investigation. I mean, and so Bob Blakey, the head of the House Select Committee investigation, said, he obstructed our investigation.
Yeah,
If Blakey said, if I'd known who he was, we would have called him as a material witness. you
yeah,
know and so that's really I hadn't thought of that until just now, but this file confirms Joannides was a material witness in JFK's assassination, and the CIA deliberately kept him away from investigators.
yeah, yeah. Or actually, the other way around. He kept the investigators away from the knowledge.
Yes, yes.
It was the fox in the hen house. So let's, knowing that history, let's talk about why they have been fighting this so much. It's because the DRE, this group out of Miami, had some real connections to Oswald and the assassination that the CIA did not want to reveal. In fact, the CIA told the Warren Commission they had minimal contacts with Oswald. They really didn't know much about him, which
No,
was,
they didn't even say minimal. They denied any contact and any knowledge of Oswald before the assassination, and certainly nothing about his activism on behalf of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. On that, they said we just didn't know anything about it, and
yeah.
that's the cover story that's been punctured and is over now.
Yes. And just so that we have a little context here, um, the denials that they gave about knowing anything about the DRE and Oswald have to be based on an assertion that they stopped working with the DRA in 1963. Everybody knows they were helping them before that and giving them lots of money,
Right.
like $50,000
A
a
month.
month. Yeah,
Yeah.
which is a tremendous amount of money back then. But all of a sudden, there's a 17-month gap in any reports coming out to make it look like they weren't dealing with the DRE in
Yeah, no,
1960.
and so the 17-month gap in the monthly reports. So just to give people context, when CIA officers are running a group like this, they write a report every month. This was the standard procedure in Miami at the time. What was the money spent for? What was achieved? What were the problems? What were the successes? Should we give them more? Should we give them less? Just kind of standard, management procedure. So Joannides had that responsibility. And with a big group like this that's getting a lot of money, that's not something you can do in your head. That's something you need to record. And these reports were, they could run from 10 to 50 pages typically, right? So when Joannides takes over, he stops filing those reports. So it's like the unregistered alias driver's license. His activities are not visible to other people in the CIA, right? Because if he filed his reports the normal way, they would have gone into the CIA archive and they could be searched and found. They're not there. So they were another sign kind of taken off the books, taken out of visibility of other people in the CIA. If somebody asks, you say, we don't know anything about that.
Yeah.
Have any
And were you
report?
able to uncover those reports in the DRE archives in Miami?
The monthly progress reports on the Cuban Student Directorate are found in the National Archives at in College Park here in the DC area. And we have them for the months leading up to when Joannides took over the group, and we have them for the months after. But the
Okay.
period when he handled the group, we have no reports.
All right. So it's a Watergate 18 and a half minute gap
It's
times
very
17
much like
months.
the 18 and a half minute gap. Yeah.
Yeah, times 17 months. Um, so, all right. So let's talk about what was going on. At that point, the DRE and the CIA were becoming more and more interested in a group called Fair Play for Cuba, which was established out of New York by a number of interesting people, James Baldwin being one of them.
Yeah,
To
no. So the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was a group of intellectuals who got together and to say that the American portrayal of the Cuban Revolution, hostility to Castro, was really unfair, and that the Cubans had overthrown a racist, brutal dictatorship, and they were making a new society, and the U.S. shouldn't be hostile to that. That was a good thing, not a bad thing. So, but they were kind of fighting uphill against the Hearst press, and the American press coverage was very hostile to a leftist like Castro, especially one who had booted out American business interests and that sort of thing. So they put an ad in the New York Times, a little ad, half page, and said, "We call for fair treatment of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee." Well, this idea catches fire. And so what happens is a lot of Americans felt the same way. And so they didn't really intend it. Norman Mailer and James Baldwin and Simone de Beauvoir, they didn't really intend to create an organization, but one sprung up and people said, okay, we'll create a Fair Play for Cuba chapter here in New York, here in Detroit, here in Boston. And they spring up spontaneously. It's an early sign of the new left in America. These are people who are sympathetic with an overseas revolution, a war of national liberation. So they're leftists, not doctrinaire, but supporting Castro and Che Guevara and all this. Well, as these groups spread around the country, and they were having public impact. On the day JFK was inaugurated, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee sent 600 people in buses to camp out in Lafayette Park across from the White House to protest U.S. policy against Cuba. So, they were mobilizing significant public opinion in a significant way. Well, the CIA immediately targets them for disruption and destruction, even though it's just American citizens exercising their First Amendment rights. They weren't part of a foreign intelligence organization. They weren't controlled by foreigners. And the CIA charter prohibits operations against American citizens, which was immediately and completely ignored. And the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is the target of CIA hostility, for the next 3 years. So when Lee Harvey Oswald, Fair Play for Cuba Committee activist becomes public in New Orleans in 1963, that's obviously going to be of interest and a target to somebody like George Joannides, who's in charge of covert operations.
Yeah, so
And
let's talk about that, because this is where another big turning point in this story, things start to really get dark here, leading
yeah,
up to the assassination. Oswald had been a defector, a Marine who went to the Soviet Union, came back with his Russian wife and daughter, lived in Dallas for a while. He had grown up in part in New Orleans, and so he
yes.
went to New Orleans allegedly to find a job in the summer of 1963, and he ends up being the chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans, which consists of a parade of one person, himself.
Yeah,
Um,
Oswald wrote to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and something that we learned recently is, and is in my story. The CIA intercepts his correspondence. The CIA has his correspondence with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in April or May of 1963. And so, yeah, they're very interested in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and taking action against it. So Oswald writes to them and says, I'm going to create a chapter in New Orleans. And they write back and say, look, that's not a good idea. You're going to get a violent backlash. Just lay low, maybe talk to some other people. Oswald ignores that suggestion and immediately goes public and gets exactly what the Fair Play for Cuba Committee feared, a violent, backlash reaction from anti-Castro exiles. When Oswald's handing out his FPCC pamphlets on the street, the Cubans get in his face. They throw the pamphlets to the wind, and these guys are shouting at each other, eyeball to eyeball, until some cops come along and arrest them for disturbing the peace. So Oswald has now called himself to the attention of a CIA backed group in New Orleans, backed for generating propaganda and political action. Well, when Oswald comes along, that's exactly what Joannides people, the DRE people in New Orleans do. They
yeah,
generate
so the
political
so the
action.
DRE is not only in Miami, they also have people in New Orleans.
Yeah, so these groups are kind of mirror images of each other. In the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is supporting Castro. It has delegations all over the country, and the Cuban Student Directorate is opposing Castro, and they have delegations all over the country and also in Latin America. So yeah, so yes, the DRE has an active delegation in New Orleans, and that's the group that takes on Oswald and publicizes him and challenges him and creates this public profile of Oswald as a Castro supporter.
Yeah, and they do that in a couple of ways. There's television footage that anybody can find on the internet of these confrontations, but he also appears in two radio programs to debate some of these
Yeah, so
DRE
not
people.
only do they challenge him in the street, but the Cuban Student Directorate challenges him to a debate on the radio, where Oswald defends the Cuban Revolution, and they make a tape of that. So now they've got a newspaper clipping, they've got a TV segment, they've got a radio interview, all about Oswald, the Castro supporter.
Yeah. So, and there's a lot of questions raised about what Oswald was doing. Was he truly an anti-Castro person who was, coming out as a pro-Castro person? And none of that do we need to answer in this interview. But what we do need to point out is that Joannides and his group confronted Oswald to create publicity.
Well, I mean, yeah, he's paying them for propaganda and political action, and that's exactly what they do. So it's hard. You have to think he intended that somehow, Um, or so that was the effect of this unknown guy in New Orleans now has a public profile. There's now a public record of him as a Castro supporter that has been generated by a CIA front group.
Yeah. And then what we know about what the DRE does after that, that's August of 63. You get to September of 63, and there's a magazine called SEE
Yeah.
magazine that publishes an article that says they want to kill Castro and they're offering a $10 million reward. But again, this is this DRE group of people putting out something calling for assassins to get Castro in, otherwise also saying, do you want to join the CIA kind of thing?
Yeah, so it's in a national publication, this C magazine. It was kind of there were a lot of these magazines at the time. They were kind of men's magazines for young men. A lot of adventure, guns, scantily clad women, um, but serious articles and lots of pictures and stuff like that. And in this thing, I mean, not only does the DRE say we want to kill Castro, but it has a lot of details about the group that are accurate, right? The DRE is connected to the CIA. It said the DRE had a base in the Dominican Republic. The DRE did have a military base in it. And so the CIA station chief, Ted Shackley, is very concerned. This is like really bad tradecraft, right? This is really poor security around the group. Um, so he demands an explanation, and the Cuban students provide one, which is pretty lame. Um, and so like you're left with like what was really going on, you know? I mean, and what was really going on, whatever the case, Joannides winked at this. It didn't bother him that they were advertising for assassins. And so maybe it was like it wasn't a serious effort to get an assassin, but that might be a way to attract soldiers of fortune, adventurers, people like Lee Harvey Oswald, right? Like
Yeah,
young men, footloose, interested in the Cold War of the day. But whatever it was, Joannides winked at it, and it shows, you know, what he was doing. So it shows the anything goes atmosphere of Miami in 1963. Oh, we're from the CIA and we want to assassinate Castro. Well, we'll just say that. We'll say that in public. We don't care anymore. And so Joannides, not only is he in touch, or his agents, know all about Oswald and his pro-Castro activities. Over here, it's like, is he fishing for an assassin at the same time his guys are talking to Oswald? I mean, you can pull a theory out of that, but I prefer not to. But it's kind of like what the hell is going on here, you know?
right,
And then you realize, yeah, this is what they didn't want to talk about because this is bad. It looks bad for the CIA. It's dirty, it's dirty tricks, it's assassination on the eve of Kennedy's assassination. So that episode with C Magazine, which I tell in my piece for JFK Facts, you know, uh, it tells you a lot about the milieu of that time and that
right.
the milieu that Joannides was operating in.
Yeah, and then within that same month, Joannides sends some of these DRE guys to New York City to start fights in Times Square with pro-Castro people.
Yeah, so this was Joannides' job, was like take on the pro-Castro forces wherever they appear. In New Orleans, Oswald, let's get a tape of that guy, let's discredit him in the media and the press. Okay. In September, college students come back. They had spent the summer in Cuba and they were curious about the Cuban Revolution. They were going to have a conference in Midtown Manhattan. Joannides sends the DRE boys to Washington. They disrupt the conference. There's a big riot, makes the front page of the New York Times. That was Joannides' job, was attack U.S. supporters of Castro, because that was a way of sustaining U.S. policy, right? Was if you eliminate the critics, well, then your policy has a good chance of being implemented.
Yeah.
So,
And so we know that by this time, and this is right before the assassination, the CIA had multiple operations that knew about Oswald and been following him.
yeah,
The first was looking at his mail when he went to Russia. And there was another one that watched him when he went to Mexico City then.
yeah.
And
So they're reading his mail in Russia when he comes back and he writes to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. This is something that we just learned. an FBI CIA informant, a spy who worked for both of those, worked at the Fair Play for Cuba committee. He let the FBI in the office. They photographed all the correspondence. So the CIA and the FBI had Oswald's correspondence with the Fair Play for Cuba committee like right away in mid 1963. So they're paying close attention to the guy. And then when he goes on to Mexico City, like you say, he pops up in a couple more CIA surveillance operations.
So they know a lot about him at that point. And again, they'll later say they knew nothing, and they'll also deny that Howard was Joannides.
Right.
So all of this is going on, and we're really, this is why this is important. We're really putting this, connecting all these dots now,
Yeah.
really by just a couple new documents that really solidify the suspicions that we've had about Joannides,
Right.
or that you've had. Um, so we then get to November of 63, and when JFK is assassinated, Joannides people go into action immediately. Describe what they did and how they used this New Orleans stuff that they had captured.
So when the president was assassinated at 12:30 in Dallas, um, he was pronounced dead at 1. By about 3 o'clock, Oswald had been arrested and his name was being broadcast. So it was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the East Coast, 5 o'clock. When the DRE guys in Miami hear the name Oswald on the radio, they remember it. That guy was tangling with our people in New Orleans. They go to their own files and they have a bunch of stuff on Oswald. The New Orleans delegation had let them know, hey, there's a communist here. We're going to take him on. Um, uh, and Jose Antonio Lanusa, a leader of the group, has described to me and is describing to other reporters that when they figured out that they had information on Oswald, what did they do? They called their American friend Howard on the night of November 22nd, and they said, "We know all about this guy," and he tells them, don't do anything. Go to the press in about an hour. Give them the information that you have. So, first of all, that's Jose Antonio Lanusa tells that story. He's alive, he's living, he's a very credible witness. And he had a long relationship with the CIA at that time. And so he immediately goes to the press. This was a group, well-funded group. They had excellent contacts. Lanusa knew many reporters from Miami Herald, Miami News, New York Times, Life magazine. And so he starts calling them all and saying, we know all about the guy who killed the president. Well, that information, based on the DRE's confrontations with Oswald in New Orleans, was all of the coverage that said Kennedy had been killed by a pro-Castro marksman, all of that. It was all based on information from the Cuban Student Directorate. It was all based on information from a CIA propaganda operation. That's what we now know. And we know that the operation was run by Joannides. And now we have testimony that somebody spoke with him on the night of the assassination and that he told them what to do. So that's like a pretty big deal, because how does that fit with the story that a lone gunman killed the president? It's very difficult to explain. If Oswald alone killed the president, why would that have been Joannides' reaction?
Yeah. I mean, just to put the finer point on it, JFK, back when the Cuban directorate was saying there were missiles still in Cuba, said, look, they're trying to find a context to make me invade.
Yeah.
They're pressuring and pushing for that. And again, when he's killed, they try to make it look like it's Castro, and it's a Castro organization. Again, another trigger to hopefully invade Cuba and get rid
No,
of it.
and there's another piece of the story that is not part of the Joannides file, but has come out in recent years. You know, the CIA itself did not believe the lone gunman theory, and they immediately, within days of the assassination, officers in the station, like Joannides, are asked, ask these questions of your Cuban contacts. Who left for Dallas recently? Who's been asking for money? Who's been seeking weapons? because their premise was Kennedy had been killed by Cubans seeking to instigate a war with Cuba. So that thought that was the motive behind the assassination, that was the first suspicion of the CIA station in Miami, not the lone gunman.
Yeah. And so you've raised the question, the central question of Joannides, which is they knew about Oswald, they knew what they were doing with him in New Orleans. And was that either uh, something that they should have known that this guy could have been a threat to the president, or was he being Oswald being set up as a patsy to
And
take the fall?
this is really the crux of the Joannides file, right? I mean, because there aren't direct references, and remember, this is a personnel file, right, which only contains administrative information about promotions, salaries, healthcare, honors, but it doesn't contain operational information. What was that CIA employee doing? So, but what the Joannides personnel file tells us is, well, so was he running this operation with these Cuban students who he was very tight with and had, a lot of control over, and they thought they could get some propaganda value out of Oswald. And then Oswald up and shoots the president, and oh my God, we have to hide it because we totally missed him. So is it that? Is it kind of incompetence, unawareness? Or are they running an operation designed to make him take the blame and blame the crime on Cuba and not on the people who really did the crime?
Yeah.
And so, you know, we don't have an answer to either of those questions. But now with the Joannides file, that question cannot be avoided. That is the crux of the matter is, did they just miss Oswald or were they manipulating Oswald?
Yeah. And so you filed a suit that lasted for 15 years to try and just get an answer to the question of, is Joannides Howard? They denied
Well,
it.
I mean, that wasn't the only question that I had, but I mean, it was the core of it because, it was such a central deception, right? I mean, once you take that away, once you say, oh no, we did know about him, well, then the whole thing, becomes much more serious. Like, and the idea, this is where, so was he just incompetent and clueless about Oswald, or was he manipulating him? Here's the thing, you look at that file. This is the other part about the Joannides file. This guy was not incompetent. Okay. He rose, his final position at CIA was he was chief of covert action in the Eastern Asia division of the clandestine service. He had 900 people working for him and he had an annual budget of $50 million a year. Okay. You don't get one of those jobs if you're incompetent.
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
way. No
And
way.
And in fact, the other main document that was released, not nearly as important as the false driver's license, was a memo that the CIA gave him a Medal of Honor, essentially, after he misled the House committee, successfully kept them from getting into CIA business.
Yeah, and that's the other really key document that in the file. You know, in giving him this why he should get this medal, his handling of the Cuban students and his stonewalling of the HSCA are explicitly mentioned. Until we had that memo as of July 3rd, I always said he stonewalled the HSCA and then he got a medal. We don't know that he got the medal for doing it. People said, "Oh, that's ridiculous." He got a medal because he had a long career. Well, then we see the thing. No, it was specifically mentioned. The people who gave him the memo knew about that.
For his special assignment.
So, yeah, yeah, a special unusual assignment, they say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that, that's another thing that tells you this thing was designed to be hidden forever.
Yeah. Now, more to come.
Yeah. So, Representative Luna asked Ratcliffe, CIA director, for a bunch of CIA records and not just things that the CIA had previously turned over to the JFK Review Board, but other documents that had come to light that were known to be JFK related, but the CIA had never made public. The really good news is Ratcliffe has a new attitude, and they're not being defensive about this. When Luna said, "Can we see the Joannides file?" Ratcliffe's staff produced it. So she's asked for a bunch more material based on recommendations from the JFK research community. And, I think that we will learn more about these events, particularly about these operations in 1963 against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Yeah.
That was the thing, like, these details about those operations, that's the thing that we only got in March, only after Trump's order. Under Biden, this stuff was still buried. And so now, with a new attitude at the CIA and a strong executive order, I think we're going to learn more, about what was really going on here, about these operations around Oswald. So
Right.
that's to come, but we are in a new landscape. We see the JFK story in a different way once we understand who George Joannides was.
Yeah. Who Howard was.
Who Howard was, exactly.
Yeah. So I can't leave this interview without asking you about current events. What
Yeah.
does all the Epstein stuff have to do with any of this, since it's so hot right now and it's on the same sort of track of reveal this stuff to
Yeah,
us?
no, frankly, in terms of mass public opinion, Epstein probably has like a bigger center of gravity than JFK. JFK is more for us, kind of the baby boomer generation. But the Epstein thing is gigantic. And I don't, the implications for the MAGA movement are pretty profound. But, what can we say? I mean, the lack of transparency, when the government does that, I mean, the reaction now is swift and strong, and people feel entitled to information now in a way they didn't before because we have so much of it. We have these personal channels. You want to talk to Trump, you talk to Trump, and he might actually hear you. So people are empowered by this new digital communications, and it's like the old idea of, well, we're just going to say, go away, there's nothing here. That does not work anymore. And it took 60 years on the JFK story to finally puncture some of these cover stories, but something akin to that is going on with Epstein. Now, what is going on? I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in it. It seems self-evident to say he wasn't blackmailing people. That seems, you wouldn't accept that without checking it. Did he have relationships with intelligence agencies? Seems quite possible and would obviously be very sensitive. So, right now, the curtain has come down. The president, the Justice Department are not going to look at that, but that tells you something about they want badly to hide something, and that's what we saw in the case of JFK.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, thanks for the time. We'll see what
Thank you.
happens. And I'm sure we'll be visiting again.
Okay, good. Hey, everybody. I wanted to call your attention to one surefire way to deepen your knowledge of the assassination of President Kennedy. And that's to read my 3 books about the CIA, a trilogy of spies that tells how the assassination actually unfolded in the eyes of CIA insiders. You see, my work on JFK's assassination is rooted not in the literature of conspiracy, but in the history of CIA operations. And that makes all the difference when it comes to understanding the events that culminated on November 22nd, 1963. You'll want to check out my 3 CIA books that tell the story of the founding generation of the Central Intelligence Agency and what 3 insiders actually thought about JFK's assassination. Meet charismatic Station Chief Winston Scott as he surveils Lee Harvey Oswald 6 weeks before Dallas. Meet urbane CIA Director Richard Helms as he fends off President Richard Nixon's attempts to blackmail him over JFK's assassination. Meet James Angleton, the ingenious, paranoid, and sinister counterintelligence chief who had controlled the agency's file on Oswald since 1959. In these books, you'll see the real historical foundation of the events that led to President Kennedy's assassination, and you'll understand this event in a much deeper way. Check out my books at jeffersonmorleybooks.com. You can buy all of these books there, as well as my other nonfiction book, Snowstorm in August. So check out the Trilogy of Spies.